Hey, business builders. It's great to be joined by Karen DiGioia today, and Karen is going to talk to us about key employee compensation. Karen, we appreciate you and everybody who's here live to bring their questions. We appreciate you all being here. And I want to say Karen was an introduction from Matt Culp. Several people in our groups have been talking about key employee compensation. How do we keep our best people? How do we reward them for the right things? And then how do we take our key employee compensation plans and use it for recruiting? And Matt stepped up and said, hey, I know Karen, I work with her, and Wayne, you really ought to have a conversation with her. And Karen, it's been great. You and I have had 2 or 3 conversations offline before this, and every time my understanding of who you are and what you offer builds. And so I'm excited for today because I think it's exactly what we need to get started and learn a little bit more. Karen is a vice president and senior HR consultant with Herbine Mosteller HR consultants, and she partners with clients in a wide variety of human resource areas. Karen works extensively with senior executives and board of directors on executive compensation design, structure, and competitive solutions. She works with clients to develop and implement compensation structures and programs which maximize the organization's ability to attract, motivate, and retain talent. Karen has educated, counseled, and trained managers and employees in all aspects of human resources, including compliance and employee relations. Karen had a 20-year career out in business before she started consulting, working in financial services and in durable medical goods provision. We'll see how current all this is. Maybe there's an update here, Karen. It says in her spare time, Karen enjoys spending time with her husband, 2 adult children, pet Havanese, and friends. She's visited 39 national parks so far.
40 now, 40. It's up to 40.
Nice.
Sorry.
And enjoys travel, music, cooking, and reading. Karen, thanks for being here. And whenever you want to start the slideshow, you tell me and I'll pull it up. So
okay. I'm not horribly driven to the slideshow, but I guess you can start it now. Thank you, Wayne. Thanks for that intro. And I'll just tag on there a little bit, not to repeat, but I've been consulting for 17 years now. I've been in HR prior to consulting for about that length of time, previous. My background is broad HR. While I consult primarily in the compensation space, my background was in employment, employee relations, compensation, HRIS, payroll, all things HR. I lead our compensation practice at this point in time with Herbine Mosteller, but it's critical to me that people know that my background isn't just comp, because comp doesn't live by itself in a little box. It touches and needs to coordinate with all things related to the employee-employer relationship. So if you're just looking at comp as a set of numbers and, oh, we got to hit this and that's all we got to worry about, you're really, really missing the point. As with so many things, it's context that is important and tells you what to do with information and data. So from my perspective, it's really critical that I put through to those folks that I'm talking with, those that I work with, that my background is broad HR. I'm typically there to help you with compensation, but again, that's within a broader context. If at any point in time, you've got questions, it tends to be a little bit more challenging with a virtual platform. I can't see all of you at any one time. I think there's probably a way for you to raise your hand. I am classically horrible at noticing when anyone is raising their hand on a virtual platform. So Wayne, if you notice, please just break in and stop me, because sometimes, again, virtually I get on a roll. And I can't see faces. I can't necessarily see if someone's looking confused or raising their hand. So please, interrupt. Next slide, if you want. I have a little bit of an agenda. This doesn't have to be formal, but in order to keep me on track and keep me from going down rabbit holes, which I probably will do anyway a little bit, but it's important to start with an agenda. When Wayne reached out initially, we started with some real, what I considered like in the weeds conversation. Hey, some of my folks are really, they got questions about how do you create a phantom stock plan, and how do you create stock, and how do you create options and all those kinds of things. And I said, from my perspective, it's real important before you get into those kind of detailed things to back up within an organization. Before you're starting to worry about long-term comp, you want to make sure you've got all the other pieces in place. So in order to lay that groundwork, I want to talk a little bit today about executive comp, all the components, what they're there to do typically, how you balance them out, and then also the importance of understanding your organization. And then once you've got that groundwork, how do you move forward? And then, because there was so much energy around long-term incentives, talk a little bit specifically and do a little bit more of a deep dive there. So hopefully that aligns with what you're hoping for and what your expectations were. Again, when Wayne and I first talked, he said one of the places that you really want to start as an organization is going to the foundation, making sure that you've got an understanding of your organization, your philosophy, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as we go. If you want to advance to the next slide, though. So a little bit of this is going to be Executive Comp 101, and I'll try not to lecture, but kind of important to look at all the various components that we've got and what they're doing. So the grid in front of you there outlines the fixed versus variable components on long-term, or on compensation, excuse me, executive comp. And then going down the side, you've got your short-term versus long-term. So under the fixed side, short-term, typically we're looking at base compensation. Not too fancy. We'll talk about that a little bit more and what you're trying to accomplish with base. Short-term, typically you've also got some variable comp going on. Annual bonus plans, commission plans, profit sharing, those kinds of things. Things that are aligned with short-term goals. Short-term usually means over the course of a year or less. Then on the long-term side, you've also got some fixed pieces. That could be 401k match. If you've got pensions in place, I'm assuming that that's not applicable here, but organizations that have pensions, if you've got SERPs, those are typically fixed, although a SERP can go the other direction. You can have performance attached there, but have a long-term nature. Employees aren't, it's not do this year and you'll get this year. It's stick with us and you'll get this in the long run, typically. Then on the long, go ahead.
What is a SERP?
A SERP, a supplemental executive retirement plan. It is it's a form of non-qualified deferred compensation. Plans are typically put in place for key executives. Typically within an organization, it's, your number one, number two, somewhere, depending on the size of the organization. If it's a large organization, somewhere along the top 5 or so. And those are often put in place to replace some of the value that can be lost because of the highly compensated limitations and those kinds of things on your 401k, as well as to create longer term wealth for your key executives. Okay. Then on the variable long-term side, you've got typically, equity plans. They have phantom stock plans, long-term cash bonus plans, and that's a piece that we will talk about in a little bit more detail. I've got that flowed in at the end of the agenda. You want to advance to the next slide. So as far as the components go, let's see, where am I? I do have notes here. So bear with me while I check. Salary, obviously, defined as, fixed compensation, almost always in the form of cash paid to the executives for performing a specific job duty. On the short-term side, typically, again, short-term bonus, you're covering typically 1 year of an operating cycle. You've got variable payments that are tied to business or individual performance results that are delivered. Ideally, there are plenty of short-term plans out there that become entitlements. if they're not tied strongly to any kind of key metrics. So sometimes they lose their incentive and reward nature. That's not necessarily how you want to design those, but it certainly does happen, and I've seen it plenty of times. Short-term incentives have the greatest ability to influence executive behavior, typically. Long-term incentives typically are covering performance periods of 3 or more years, typically 3 to 5. You don't usually see it going longer than that. It provides for variable payments, again, based on longer-term business results. It has a very retentive nature. And we'll talk in a minute about what each of these various components can do for you. Employee benefits, usually those are pretty much a given. At the executive level, it's the same thing that other employees or full-time employees are receiving. Just includes health and welfare, medical disability, PTO, basic retirement benefits, and that kind of thing. And then we've got the supplemental executive benefits, which may be additional, could be, you've got perks out there in some organizations, whether it's executive life insurance, it could be, country club memberships and those kinds of things. But typically you've got benefits beyond what is permitted within qualified plans. So we were talking a minute ago about SERPs, supplemental executive retirement plans. They are non-qualified, considered deferred compensation plans, often delayed. There are allocations made into those plans each year by the organization, but the executive or key employee doesn't receive those until retirement. So that would supplement the 401k and whatever else that executive had done on their own. Typically, those plans are not performance-based. You want to go on to the next slide? So these pieces typically are all brought together as part of an organization's overall executive compensation package. The mix of those components can look different from organization to organization and can vary drastically depending on the type of organization. It looks, this pie chart, which I included as a somewhat typical balance within private companies of the various components, would look very different for someone working in a governmental entity or someone working in a nonprofit. But within private organizations, base comp is typically going to make up, I'm going to say 40, 50%. And don't do the math here because the percentages that I throw out will definitely end up adding up to more than 100%, but typically in the range of 40 to 50%. Short-term and long-term incentives, from my perspective, best practices is to have a relatively balanced approach to those two. Because your key folks, typically you want to keep them, depending on what your goals are for the long-term plan. But if you're looking to motivate them and keep their line of sight and focus on the metrics that are associated with receiving a payout under one of these plans, you want to keep them focused on the short term, but you also want to keep them focused on the long term. So sometimes within an organization, you over-focus on short term, you're making decisions, your key folks are doing things at the expense of long-term performance of the organization. Because it's good in the short term, it's going to bring me a good payout this year, but it's really 3 years from now, we're going to regret that we made this decision. So if you keep a balance between those two components when you're designing it, it helps ensure that your folks are keeping a balanced look at what's the impact in the short term, what's the impact in the longer term, to ensure that you're not making shorter term decisions at the expense of longer term performance. And then those supplemental benefits typically come in and make up another 10% or so. So my math there said 40 or 50 plus 25 and 25 plus 10, and that definitely equals more than 100. But it gives you a sense of what the balance on those components look like. And pointing out the differences as well. On the base side of compensation, your base expense, the base salary that you're paying to your key folks, your executives, that's a fixed commitment. One of the benefits of the short-term and long-term is you've got the ability to, those are variable pay. So in a good year, when the organization is doing well, the company's got a strong year, you've got the ability to pay out, you're going to be paying out higher amounts or contributing higher amounts into it if it's a long-term. In years where things are not going so well, those may end up in some circumstances, if it's a really horrible year, they may be zero. So it gives the organization the ability to have components of compensation that follow the performance of the organization. So it helps from the company's perspective. It also ensures that, again, your key folks are focused on the performance against whatever those key metrics for your organization are. Before moving on, just a little bit more about the mix of components. There is not a single one right answer. And in a little bit, we'll talk a little bit about the importance of knowing what your compensation philosophy is. I work with clients that say, even at our executive level, we are 100% base and a little bit on the supplemental and benefit side, because that's consistent with our culture, that's consistent with our mission, our goals, not necessarily what I would consider overall best practices and the way I would guide most organizations to go. But for some organizations, that's okay and that's right. We also have organizations that say we're paying everybody in our senior team the exact same base amount. We don't care what variability there is out in the market, but we believe in we're a very much team approach. So the point of what I'm trying to say here, this is not a one size fits all. This is not, it's for every organization, this pie chart's got to be the same. Plenty of organizations that do not, especially, given the size of your organization, have nothing in the long-term side because it's much more complex or at least less obvious. You've got to be much more intentional in designing a long-term incentive plan within a smaller company. It's not to say that you can't do it, but there are lots of smaller organizations that say it's all based in short term right now. And that's where we are, and that's okay. So moral of the story is that the chart shows you what's kind of typical there, but that doesn't mean every organization is going to look like that or that every organization should look like that. Okay. All right, next slide. So now to talk a little bit about the various components and what they typically can do for your organization. For the most part, big picture, what should any compensation program, whether it's executive or at other levels of the organization, what are you looking for it to do for you? You're looking for it to position you to attract, retain, and motivate the talent that you need. Pretty basic. Really. Different components, while each component can do pieces of that to some extent, different components do more of some portions. So the salary, primarily, your salaries need to be set in a way that allows you to attract the folks you need. It also needs to continue to be set so that it allows you to retain it. In a time like we're in right now, you may be paying folks based on compensation that was offered to them 5 years ago, and you've moved it up incrementally each and every year. Well, the market's moved a whole heck of a lot in that period of time. So while where you place those salaries and moving them up based on 5 years ago was competitive and positioned you to attract those folks in, that doesn't guarantee that it's now positioning you to retain them. Because there are a whole lot of organizations doing a whole lot of crazy things out there to bring people in. And we'll talk a little bit more about the importance of knowing how you stand from a competitive standpoint. But typically the strength that salary is best targeted at allowing you to attract people in. On the short-term side, typically that's strong on the ability to attract as well as to motivate. I always say to clients, the good news about incentive plans is they change behavior. The bad news about incentive plans is also they change behavior. So if you don't design them appropriately, they could be influencing behavior the wrong way. But your short-term incentive plans are going to impact the actions, decisions, and behavior of your folks in those plans. On the long-term side, and short-term, because it's short-term in its nature, has very limited impact on the ability to retain folks. There was a client that I've worked with over the years that has what they call a super bonus that kicks in. I think it's every 10 years or something like that. Maybe it's a little more frequently. And it's really got strong retention for them because every 10 years, 5 years, whatever the period is, they pay out bonuses, and this is across the full organization. Pay out bonuses that are well in excess of the market. Well, right after that super bonus gets paid out every year, what do you think happens? They have a boatload of employees that leave. So that they've got a retentive nature, but it's a cliff impact on that. So again, bonus programs typically aren't real strong, especially on the short term, on retention. Long term has what I would call sort of a medium level of improving your ability to attract folks, because there are a lot of organizations that do not have a long-term incentive plan. Depending on where you're trying to recruit your folks from, there may very well not be an expectation that there's a long-term opportunity for them within the organization. Long-term incentives can be very high in the ability to motivate and impact behavior, and can have a very high retentive value. I qualify that though, because it's also important to realize that if another organization wants to woo one of your key employees away badly enough, typically they can put in place a hiring bonus that will equal or get close enough to the value that someone may be leaving behind on the long-term side of things. So while it has definitely retentive value, sometimes it's that mental, well, I'm not looking for something because I'd be leaving this on the table. It's certainly not perfect from that perspective, but it does have value. Employee benefits really are low. They're that you got to do it. You got to provide it. That's just the white bread and the peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It's got to be there. Supplemental executive benefits can help you potentially attract folks in. They typically don't have, unless you're adding some sort of performance aspect to a SERP or something like that, don't have a motivational value, but they can, again, have a medium to high retentive value, because typically, especially if you're looking at a SERP plan or something like that, you've got a longer term nature to that. So if an employee isn't going to get the value out of their SERP until they retire, if they leave prior to retirement, then that value isn't theirs anymore. Does that make sense? Any questions? Anybody raising hands? Anybody falling asleep? The people
Yes,
I can see are taking notes or they're answering emails. I'm not sure which it is. So every time now and then I see people look down. So I'm hopefully taking notes.
Anybody have any questions so far? And we will have time at the end too. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
All right, moving on. Okay. So now you've got a little bit of an understanding, at least hopefully, a reasonable foundation of the various components that are part of executive comp and what they're best used for. Again, when Wayne and I first started talking, and the focus was on that long-term piece of things, and most of the questions I think that people were coming through were, related to, phantom plans and that kind of thing, which is all great. But if the foundation, if your base and your annual comp aren't in place and aren't strong, it's the equivalent of saying, hey, I want to put a sunroom on my house, but the foundation is crumbling. So you got to make sure you got a real solid foundation before you start to build that sunroom. So if you're interested in moving forward within your organization, in addition to understanding kind of the basics on executive compensation, you also need to know your organization. Next slide. So hence my know thyself. And what do you need to know? You need to know, one, what's your compensation philosophy? Your compensation philosophy really is your roadmap. It's a statement that captures how you intend to pay. Do you intend to be competitive with the marketplace within which you compete for customers and clients? Do you intend to, do you realize you don't have the ability to compete on base pay? So we're going to lag the market on base, but when we have a good year, we are going to overshare across the organization so that we're all driving towards certain success factors. And when we meet that, you're going to make more than the competitors are. Because guess what? This is an exciting place to work. And one of the things on here is also know what your competitive advantages are as an employer. What sets you apart? What you're doing may be a great place for folks to come in, to learn and build something exciting. They may have to take a discount on base compensation. And again, maybe you build your annual plan so it overpays. We're working toward this goal. There's all kinds of positive energy and we're relying on some of the internal aspects to allow us to attract folks in, paying a little bit below maybe what competitors would. You also need to know who your competition is. Where are you looking to attract employees from? And with what organizations are you most at risk to lose your folks? Because if you don't have a baseline understanding of that and how competitive you are against other organizations, other peer organizations, then you are at risk. You go out there to attract talent in and you find out that, that number that worked for you 3 years ago is bringing candidates through the door, let alone the candidates that you want. So it's important to understand, to define who you're competing with for talent and to know what those organizations are paying. Again, the middle column there, we talked a little bit about know your competitive advantages as an employer. What do you have to offer? Because when you're having those conversations with potential candidates, or when you're marketing your brand within the organization, it's important to have a solid understanding of what sets you apart. What makes your organization a place people want to work? Is it the culture? Is it the management? Is it what you're doing? Is it the product that you offer? What do you have? What makes people want to work for you? Okay. We talked about knowing the competitive market. You also need to know your employees. A lot of you have, reasonably small organizations. Hopefully you're talking to your employees and hopefully they're talking to you. But you want to make sure that you're creating opportunities to gather feedback from your employees about what they value, what they need, what they want. I had a conversation with a client recently, and they had, forget what, the details here are a little sketchy, but I think it was back in 2020, they had rolled out some sort of employee benefit program that had some reasonable expenses attached to it. But employees weren't making use of it. And in a focus group that I was doing with an employee group, actually on a totally different topic, but this benefit came up. And a couple of the employees said, you know what, it was 2020. We were in survival mode. All we needed was like a free subscription to the call map. It would have had 1/10 of the cost of whatever the benefit that the organization did offer. And it would have met a real need that the employees had at the point in time. But because that organization wasn't talking to their employees, wasn't truly listening, they put something out that had no value to the employees. It had significant expense, but it had no value. So if you're not gathering feedback, now some of you have organizations that are a little bit larger. Engagement surveys can bring a lot of feedback back. There are lots of ways to get information from your employees, but it's really critical to take that time to listen and to truly be open to hearing what your employees have to say. And this is at all levels of the organization. Because otherwise you may take actions that end up being completely and totally off the mark. And that is often a big waste of time and money. So critical there. All right, I think next slide. Are we on to long-term? And I have no idea what time it is. So
Yeah, we have about 45 minutes left.
okay, all right, so that's good.
Yeah.
That's good. Give me 1 second to grab a quick sip of water.
You've earned it so far, so.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's good to hear, I think. Oh, can we go back to the previous slide? I think I need to ramble on a tiny bit more. When we're talking about, you're knowing your compensation philosophy, one of the things that you want to make sure is that when you're looking at comp and how you're designing and how you're is that you've got consistency, that you're tying all these various things to the overall values and mission of the organization, so that your values and beliefs should be a portion of what you're considering looking at as you're defining. My guess is, and I'd love it if I'm wrong, but my guess is the bulk of the organizations and the bulk of your companies don't have a defined compensation philosophy statement.
That's fair.
Would I be correct in that assumption?
Yes.
Yes.
Do you have mission and value statements?
A lot of them do.
And that would be my guess. So ensuring that you've got a compensation philosophy statement and that you take, my recommendation is have it in writing. But even if you don't have it in writing, at least have it in your minds. Because that becomes the guide against which all the rest of your decisions are benchmarked. As opposed to saying, hey, all right, we've got this competitive market survey. We know what the market looks like, and hey, we're underpaying. And then you start just making random moves in reaction to a set of numbers. But if you've got, you have a compensation study done, you see how you compare to the external market, then you touch that back to all these various points. Touch it back to your compensation philosophy. How did we say we intended to pay? Okay. So if we've got gaps, how do we address those gaps in a manner that's consistent with our compensation philosophy? If we need to step outside our compensation philosophy for a subset of reasons, we've got a succession planning issue, we've got to address it. Our comp philosophy says that we are targeting base compensation at 50th percentile of the market, just making it up. But we've got an emergency situation. The candidate we need to attract, we're going to have to pay 75th percentile of the market in order to do that. Okay, why are we doing it? We're stepping outside our philosophy. Do we have a good reason for it? So a philosophy statement there is not to back you into corners and create a rule book that says, you know, you can't do what you need to do when you need to do it, but it does create a touch point that you use when you're making decisions to ensure that you are making them in an intentional manner, as opposed to being reactive. So it positions you to be much more proactive in your decision making. Okay.
Yeah, this is totally gold, Karen. Like when I think of the business owners that come to camp, and I was telling you how we do this, how we do some planning when we're together and create projects. Like answering these questions is a project that Kane or Matt or whoever could decide to take up for the next 90 days just to get clarity around these things. And when we write it down, it gets so much more real. So yeah, this is really helpful.
Yeah. Good. A lot of these things, you know, before you start moving forward, and this is true with so many things, you got to take a couple steps back. Because if you start moving forward too quickly, you often, you know, start moving in the wrong direction. And it takes you until you're about halfway down the path sometimes before you realize, oh, wait a minute, we meant to be over there. So if you take the time to take those steps back, be intentional, build a plan, then you go for it, which was, again, where my concern was when we, you know, if we jump off too quickly into long-term incentive comp. And I just recently had a new client I started working with, and they reached out at that time and said, hey, we want to, you know, we're concerned about executive retention. You know, can you work with us to develop a long-term plan? And I said, well, do you know how you're positioned against your peer organizations from a comp perspective? Do you know what your comp philosophy is? No, they hadn't had an executive comp study done ever. They were just making decisions on the fly, and it was working with, I'd say, about a 60% success factor. I said, before we start building other things, let's move back. You know, let's do a market study, see how your current pay practices compare to the market. Find out where the gaps are. Figure out how you intend to pay, and then start building things. Because again, if their short-term, if their base comp and their short-term compensation plan aren't competitive, and those are the pieces that, you know, if you recall, that are strongest at bringing folks in, if they're not positioned to bring folks in and help you retain the people you've got, putting a long-term plan on is like building a sunroom if your foundation is crumbling. So that's, you know, that's what this client did. We're working with them right now on a competitive market study on their top 10 positions to figure out where their base and annual bonus comp, how that compares to their competitors. And then we'll go forward and figure out what they need to do to shift and adjust and become more competitive. And they may find out that they're paying perfectly. Probably not, but and then we'll start building long-term plans.
Okay.
Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now a little bit of deeper dive on long-term incentives. So on the long-term side, there are lots of purposes that a long-term incentive plan can have. And this is not to say that every organization looks at their long-term plan to do all of these things. So typically when I'm working with an organization that says we need a long-term plan, the first question is why? What do you want it to do? For some organizations, it's about ensuring that your executive team and their interests are aligned with owners and shareholders, especially in a public company. Others organizations feel like it's a key piece that they need in order to attract and motivate their executive teams. Other organizations have a strong belief in ensuring that they are creating long-term wealth for key executives on the team. But depending on what your goals are for a long-term plan, what you develop may look different. When we talk about long-term, typically, I think for most people, it's the equity plans that come to mind. It's options, restricted stock, performance shares, those kinds of things. But there are ways to build long-term plans without tying them to equity. Phantom plans, and we'll talk about phantom plans a little bit more in a minute. But I also have clients with long-term cash plans, so that they are similar to an annual plan, but they have longer term goals, metrics that they are associated with, and they also have vesting that's associated. So that can be sometimes the simplest way to create a long-term plan if you don't have equity or aren't in a position to go out broadly with the stock that you do have. I've talked recently with a couple of clients who want to get some kind of long-term, and they've got a pretty solid short-term plan in place. And I said, well, how about just taking your short-term plan, putting it on steroids a little bit, increasing where your bonuses are, and creating a carve-out deferral portion of the short-term. So 25% of what's earned in the short-term goes into a deferral that can gain or lose based on certain performance parameters, and you attach vesting 3 to 5 years. Doesn't always have to be extremely fancy to work and to be effective. The why behind long-term incentive plans can look like, executive ownership. If there are folks on the executive team or key employees who are not owners of the organization and you want to bring them in. Again, having the ability to compete with other organizations. If you are looking to attract people who are coming from key spots in public companies and have had long-term plans in the past, then that can be an expectation. There are other ways to meet that expectation at times, but sometimes organizations are putting it in place from that specific purpose. Tax advantages, certainly both on the employee and the employer side, potentially with long-term plans, and also allows some organizations, if you're using equity, to conserve cash or to, again, on a deferral side of things, put off that payment. So, next slide. Next slide, questions. I thought there was something more though.
I prepared a handout for everybody, Karen.
Yeah.
That, well, I mean, some people may have gotten it, some not through invite.
Okay.
And
yeah, I think I didn't, sorry, I didn't put a slide in here on the phantom plan, and I can.
Oh yeah, I think just to like, if you could explain just the definition of equity, options, your list there. If you could just go through a quick definition of each, that would be helpful.
Sure. Okay, and this is going to be just off the top of my head, not textbook, but equity is
even better.
Equity is stock, stock in a company. So it's a piece of company ownership. Options provide the recipient with the option to purchase stock, but isn't actually a grant. So typically options only have value to a recipient if the stock price goes up. So if I get an option to purchase stock at $20 an option, that's the strike price at the time, and the stock goes down to $16, I have zero value. If I get those options at $20 and it goes up to 24, I've got $4 of value, and I've got the ability to buy, paying $20 basically for $24 worth of stock. And this is really oversimplified. If anybody can do this better than me, feel free. Restricted stock is stock grants. So it's here, I'm giving you a share of stock. You don't have to buy it. But typically with restricted stock, there are restrictions put on it to say you need to, it can be time restrictions. So the grant is awarded today, but it doesn't vest for 3 years. So you've received the award, but you don't really get anything until you've been around for 3 years. So that has a retentive value. Performance restrictions can also be put on restricted stock. And that means there are certain metrics associated with it. So we've got to hit net income of X before anybody gets these actual grants, or some other metrics that are associated with it. So again, the award is put out today, but it's got performance restrictions. And sometimes you have performance and time restrictions. So you've got 3 years in order to hit a certain level of performance against the metric. Performance shares are relatively similar. Cash long-term plans, I think we talked about that a few minutes ago. And that is, again, not equity involved at all, but to say, okay, at the end of 3 years, if X is achieved, if you're one still here, and we've achieved certain performance hurdles, or we've hit certain performance hurdles, then $50,000 is yours. And typically you've got a constant, each year you've got a new hurdle on each of these. You've got a new plan in place.
One thing about that one, Karen, is there's a book called Built to Sell. And in the book, and this is something that I know I've talked to several people about here. In the book Built to Sell, he lays out a very clear formulaic way. He doesn't call it cash long-term plans, but that's what it is. It's a way of having the short-term bonus, a portion of it roll over to subsequent years. You don't get to take it all out at once.
Yeah.
But for everybody who's familiar with that, that would fall into cash long-term plans. Okay. And how about,
and the cash, I mean, it can go both ways, where it's a separate carve-out plan, that this is our long-term cash incentive plan, and you've got your annual plan and you've got your long-term plan. But I'm a fan of doing the carve-out on the short term, and just saying, hey, deferral of 25% of it. And, again, there are plenty of long-term plans that strictly have time vesting associated with it. So you just got to stay in order to get it. You've got to not quit and not get fired. And at the end of whatever the period of time is, 3 years, 5 years, if you put it too far out, then it becomes non-tangible. 3 to 5 is really kind of the sweet spot on vesting. And if you've got a constant roll going each year, you don't hit that cliff that I talked about with that, the super bonus plan, where it's just paying out once every 5 years or 10 years. Again, I forget which it is, but that really does, anything with a cliff, then the impact is people are going to stay through that date and then leave, because it's just that the next cliff is too far out. But if you've got a constant roll going on a long-term plan, each year there's a new re-up. And that's, you know, while you certainly can find other organizations, especially right now with the high level of competition for talent, that will offer a sign-on bonus that may, you know, I threw out $50,000. Plenty of organizations are more than willing to pay $50,000, but it creates a mental barrier for your key employees and executive team. That mindset of, you know, if I leave, I'm leaving this on the table. So they always know that they've got it out there, and that can certainly keep them from going out and looking for something else actively.
And
Now, having said all of this, and I didn't give because, you know, I said at the beginning, while I work 80%, in 80, 90%, whatever, in comp now, my background is broad HR. And comp is just a piece of the puzzle. If you put all of your marbles, is that what it is? No, I'm losing my marbles. But if you put all your eggs in the compensation basket and you ignore strong management, healthy culture, you know, all of those, employee development, and this, again, this is at all levels. This is important for key employees as well as, you know, everyone else. If you ignore all those other things, folks are going to leave anyway, because they're not just looking for compensation. It's, you know, there's Maslow's hierarchy. If everybody remembers, you know, if you took Psych 101 and you've got the, you know, the little pyramid, and the bottom is, you know, shelter, and I'm not going to get this 100% right, but, you know, basic needs. And when we're talking key employees, that basic needs are, you know, they're hopefully making their monthly bills and all those kinds of things. They've got food, clothing, and shelter. But as you go up, the need for, you know, the next level, there's need for acceptance and that kind of thing. But those higher levels, the importance of development, of having meaning in the work that you're doing. And that doesn't have to always be altruistic meaning. But, you know, I know how I connect to the organization. I know that the work that I do is important and meaningful. I know how I fit into this organization. This organization has a healthy culture. It's a good place to be. I feel good about the decisions we make, the way we do business, the way we operate in the community, the way we treat our employees. If any of those things are off balance and out of whack, your compensation program is not going to matter. So it's just important context. This doesn't do everything for you.
Sure. What are phantom plans? What's your memory definition of that one?
Okay, so a phantom plan, and there are different ways to build it, but it's a long-term incentive vehicle that basically looks like equity, but it isn't. There's no actual stock behind it. Used widely by privately held companies. There are different ways you can do it. You can build it with full value awards, which means if you're giving a phantom grant, again, it's like a stock grant or restricted stock grant where you get the full value of that, or you can have an appreciation award where you only get the gains. But basically, it's a promise to pay based on a value that stock would have had if it existed. Typically behind that, you have to attach it to, you know, book value or some other kind of valuation method. If your organization is having annual valuations done, typically you've got those numbers there and can build a phantom plan to attach to them. If you don't have that done, that can certainly bring expense in needing to have an annual valuation done. But it's basically pretend stock.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
So Karen.
Yep.
I think would be great is if you could, so you're a friend of Business Builder Camp now, so, and we appreciate that. And
Great.
so it would be helpful to know, in case anybody here would like to work with you, how does that work? What are just a couple of the next steps? And it's also helpful, Kane, for example, is at this show in Baltimore. It's possible that tonight he goes to dinner and somebody goes, wow, I just can't keep talented employees and I don't know what to do. And he may be able to, like, we like doing that, introducing you if it's going to be helpful for our friends, which, clearly your stuff. So for that reason, we'd like to know how you work too.
Okay. We work in a lot of different ways. I mean, first of all, I'm happy to send my contact information out, or Wayne, maybe you can distribute that through email.
I'll send your slides too, by the way.
Okay, that's good. Email, cell phone, all of those kinds of things. I'm always happy to chat with whomever. We work with clients on lots of different bases. If we've got, defined projects and those sort of things, typically we'll work on a project fee basis, create a proposal. Here's the scope of work. This is the objective. This is what we're trying to do. This is what it'll cost. We also have lots of clients who we work with on an hourly basis and just say it's not highly definable work. We want to have a conversation. I need your support when I need it. And can I reach out and run things off? I think we got 50% of an idea of what we want to do here, but I want to be able to bounce some thoughts off you or bring you in at certain points in time. Typically, that's the kind of thing that we'll do under either an engagement letter and do that work on an hourly basis. If it's just a 15-minute, half-hour conversation, just give me a call and that's free. Did that answer the question there?
Yeah, mostly. What would it look like? What would be so obviously we'd talk to you and share what we got going on and where we're at, but then I would probably typically, sometimes you do all those steps for somebody, I take it, where you help with the compensation philosophy, competitor research, all those things. And sometimes it sounds like maybe you help with just checking that the balance of short-term incentive and long-term incentive is right.
Sure, like the example I gave earlier about a relatively new client that reached out a couple months ago, and they said, hey, it was referred to you and we want to build a long-term plan. And the conversation went from there. And I said, like, give me some background, tell me, first of all, why? What's the motivation behind this? Well, we're having issues retaining. We're also having problems attracting folks. We're in a very competitive market. I said, well, do you know how your current pay compares to the organizations with which you compete for talent? And their answer was no. I said, well, how about we go back to some basics, build some basics here, find out how you align with the competitive market. Let's do an executive comp study and take it from there. And that's what we've been doing. So within that process, we'll also end up defining a comp philosophy statement and then make some decisions on, again, where their gaps are, where the most critical gaps are, and how it's appropriate for them to fill those. Every organization is unique. So that's one of the strengths from my perspective of the organization that I work for. We don't have out-of-the-box solutions. We work with clients to get to know them, to get to know their organization, to get to know their culture, the struggles that they're having, where they're finding their successes, what their strategic plan is, what the long-term and what they need to achieve, and then figuring out how to get them from where they are now to where they need to be.
Great.
From an HR perspective.
Yeah, so that all answers the question. Thanks for that. And yeah, I mean, if you're good with it, it'd be great if we just kind of open it up for questions. I would invite everybody to, try to make your question as concise as possible. And I see that Matt has one. Matt, you just want to say that? Go for it.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Karen. This is great information regarding the long-term incentive plans. So that would be like the restricted stock or stock options, the phantom stock, the actual equity. Is there, how do you typically see or recommend business owners share any sort of financials, or how do they determine what financial metrics to share with the key people that they're designing that long-term incentive plan for?
Yeah, I mean, organizations are, as we already said, each organization is unique, and the willingness to share information across those key employees can differ. The degree of transparency that's out there. You can certainly build things if there's a concern about sharing some of that information. That's something that you take into consideration as you're designing the plans, and ensure that it's not structured in a manner that would have you going out there with information that you're not comfortable to do.
Is that part of what when you engage a client? Is that part of some of the discussion that you'll have with the business owner?
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah. Another. Oh, the other question was Wayne saying, does anybody have any questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
About the compensation philosophy statement. Maybe can you give an example of that, or a little more information on what you mean by that?
Sure. In fact, if you bear with me, just because rather than trying to make it up, give me a sec. I'm going to pull up. No, I'm not going to pull it up. Never mind. I'm trying to talk and look for a file at the same time, and it's not going to work. So I will just do the talking. Typically what you do is look at each of the components and determine as an organization, okay, our intention on base pay is to be competitive within our geographic region, within the industry in which we work. We're targeting 50th percentile, which means the middle of the market. Other organizations may say, hey, we really need, in order to bring in the talent that we need, we've got to target 75th percentile. We've got to outpay our competition in order to attract in the talent that we need. So within that statement, you may be saying we, target paying above the 50th percentile. Other organizations may say, we've got competitive advantages within our market. People come to work for us and they would do it for free. Probably not that, but they'll do it. They want to work for us badly enough that they will make less money to do so. So you may say, paying between the 25th and 50th percentile. Nonprofit organizations frequently have the ability to do that because they're bringing in folks who have a strong belief in the mission and values of the organization. They're strongly tied to what that organization is about. Nonprofit isn't known for paying well, specifically. Not that there aren't exceptions to that, but people rarely work in nonprofit to get rich. They work in nonprofit for more internally driven because they believe in the mission of the organization. So a nonprofit organization may say, we're targeting base at 25th percentile of the market. And then within that philosophy statement, they pull out some of the other pieces, culture, mission of the organization, those things that have intrinsic value for the people that work there. But you go through that with each of your components. variable, there are organizations out there that are like, we're mid-market, we are, plain vanilla on everything. We're not differentiating, we're just shooting in the middle of the market, base, annual bonus, maybe we got a long-term, maybe we don't. There's nothing we're using as a differentiator on comp. And that's okay. There are organizations that say, guess what? Base comp, that fixed piece, is gonna lag. We're putting more of our eggs in the variable comp basket. So when we perform, you are gonna out-earn people at other organizations. When we don't, you're gonna make your base and that's fine, and you'll be able to pay your bills, but nothing to write home about. So again, within that philosophy statement, you gotta figure out what it is you're intending to do and which components you're looking to drive, if any. And if it's just, hey, we're mid-market, we just wanna be competitive, that's okay. And that's what you say within your statement. Did that help?
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty interesting because, like you mentioned, the Built to Sell book, his mentality was kind of mid-market or even low market type people, and just train them to do repetitive tasks. But I've read other things that say, you want the best people because they can perform, and you don't need as many of them. So it's just sort of part of your philosophy, like you said.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. I mean, if you're looking at hourly workers, there are two different philosophies there. When early in my career, I think this has a connection. I worked for an organization that had, it was an IT firm, a large medical IT provider. And their philosophy, whether they had it in writing or not, I can't even tell you, because at that point in time, I was just a recruiter hiring people. But their philosophy was hire a lot of people right out of college, comp sci majors, programmers, work them hard. They had a fun environment. They had, volleyball teams and baseball teams and all those kinds of things. Work them hard, wear them out, and after 5 years, let them go somewhere else. So their comp, and that's what they needed. They needed a whole lot of 0 to 5 year out of college programmers, system analysts, that kind of thing. So they designed a comp program that supported that, and everything else within the culture supported it as well. Career opportunity, yes, it was there, but it was there for a very small portion of the population. And that was okay. And they knew after that first 3 to 5 years, they had turnover. They had a very active college recruiting program. Every year they'd bring in a new, 200 employees into the college, and they'd start them through the cycle again. It worked for them, and it was, it was a good, still have tons of friends that work there. It was a great first job, but that wasn't by accident. That was the way it was designed, the comp structure, everything within that company structure and culture supported that.
Other questions?
I guess it's too late to say goodbye to Eugene. But I'm really bad at watching the.
But he's right. He's hungry for this stuff, so he'll reach out to you. Tracy.
Yeah, just a quick question. So you talked about doing like studies to do, comparable compensation in our area for that kind of position or whatever. I don't know, you mentioned some kind of like studies that you can do to do that and to do your homework. For a really small company like ours, are there any resources that you have to recommend where we could just get online and say, like, in our area, what does this position typically pay? Like just Indeed.com or something like that? Is that the best where to go?
You can. Are they good resources? Not necessarily.
Okay.
And the odd thing is, and just, not plugging for me, but if you need a little bit of market data and you just need one position, typically that's like about an hour of billable work. It's going to cost a couple $100 and it's going to give you good quality data. There are lots of places to find bad compensation data out there anymore. And the thing that cracks me up, really, salary.com is one of those where you know, they've got, if you go on salary.com, you Google, you know, whatever the job is and stuff, you'll get numbers back. They have professional databases. We use one of them. They have very, very different numbers than what comes back if you go and do a search on your own. And if you do a search on your own, you're going to get the same thing. Every employee is going in and Google searching on their job to determine that they are underpaid by at least 20%. One of the things I typically isn't doing is slicing and dicing by geographic region, type of industry, size of organization. It's just broad brushing. So that's one of the downsides. It could get you, you know, sometimes you go out and do that and you get some decent numbers. A lot of times it's a little wonky.
Okay, well, that's good to know that you're saying that your company would do like just an hourly, you know, billable hourly kind of service like that.
Sure, I do all kinds of one-offs for,
Okay.
for you know, current clients as well as new folks who say, hey, there's a nonprofit I did some work for the other year, and it was actually a nonprofit that one of my clients was on the board, and he said, we just need data for one job. Like, can you help us?
Okay, great.
Take an hour or two, and yep, absolutely.
Melissa has a question.
Thank you, Karen. This is
Yeah.
helpful. I was interested in early on, you said that, and I don't know if I'm quoting you verbatim, but you said something along the lines of you sometimes see after large bonuses, people soon thereafter will move on. Did I hear you correctly? Is that correct?
Well, I think what you're referencing, I was talking about this one employer that has this super bonus that happens I know I keep vacillating back on whether it's 5 years or 10 years. I think it is 10 years, but that just feels so long now. But, and so that has a retentive nature for them. No one leaves the 2 years before the super bonus pays out because the super bonus is almost here. You know, it's like kids being good before Santa Claus comes. You know, it's
Right.
like, you know, so the super bonus is here. The super bonus is here. So for a couple of years right before that, it has huge retentive nature. So people stay until that super bonus pays out. And then anybody who has an interest in, you know, and was waiting to leave, it's kind of like COVID. I mean, we ended up with a whole lot of pent up turnover after COVID because nobody was going anywhere at that point in time.
Yeah.
So this super bonus, because it's once every 10 years, they end up with pent up turnover because nobody's going to leave that on the table, but they'll leave right after they got it.
So they're delaying the inevitable in a sense by.
Exactly.
It's
Exactly.
called, I mean, that's a great name, super bonus.
Oh, it is. So much excitement. And yet
Yeah.
when you back up from it and say, is this really working? And I can get off on another tangent.
No, I
about
gotcha.
Building
Okay.
things for retention purposes, because the last thing, the bad side to building really strong retentive vehicles is you keep people there that shouldn't be there anymore. Because at the end of the day, if it's time for someone to move on.
It's funny. I bet it was born from good intentions and a good strategy. I'm
Oh, it
gonna
was.
be a forever optimist, which is part of my persona, and then it somehow got cracked and broken.
Exactly. And I think I said earlier in some of my ramblings here that the good news about incentive plans is they work and they change behavior. They impact behavior. The bad news about incentive programs is they impact behavior. And if you haven't thought it all the way through, you're at risk for unintended consequences.
Yeah.
So one of my words of wisdom there is never, ever, ever mark an incentive plan as final. Because there's always the potential of needing to tweak it. And always have discretionary language in your incentive plan document that says, if the unforeseen happens, we've got the ability to step outside and use discretion.
I developed a bonus plan that enticed people to contain continuing education, and without setting parameters, everyone went gunning for it like the road runner, and I didn't see that coming, and everybody earned it rapido, and I was like, wow, that didn't give me the longevity I was hoping for. So I can respect what you're saying.
Yeah. And no matter how many times you do it and how hard you try, sometimes you miss potential impacts. And that, again, that's why it's good to always look at these things, at least annually, once you've got them in place. Is it doing what we need it to do? Or does it need to be tweaked?
Thank you.
Sure.
Karen, not a question, but there's 4 minutes left. And it strikes me that so much what you're talking about is about leadership and communicating with people about a topic that can be sensitive and that, like, mom and dad told us not to talk about, which is money.
Mhm.
And I hear through all of this, really communicating with people, talking with people, helping them slow down and see both the short-term and long-term value. I hear you talking about, this is something we end up, it's underneath a lot of what we talk about in Business Builder Camp or with my one-on-one clients, is trying to really, really put myself in the shoes of the other person, like really understand who they are, what's important to them, etc. So,
but don't make assumptions, to my point
Right.
earlier. You can't make assumptions
Right.
about what that other person thinks, believes, finds important, values, whatever. You've got to have, and communication. Absolutely. I'm speaking at a convention next week in Orlando, and the overall topic is on how to thrive in spite of the challenge to attract and retain talent right now. And this is on a broader level. But we talk about compensation and all those kinds of things, but what I was talking about before is you can't put everything, you can't rely on just compensation and communication, no matter what it is, communicating with your employees. And that's two-way communication. It's not me as the business owner telling you, it's really listening and being available to listen and creating an organization where it is safe to speak honestly. Because people are thinking and saying what they're going to think and say, regardless of whether they can think and say it to you. And it's better to hear it and have an understanding and an ability then to work within that context and that understanding than to not be aware.
Karen,
Ignorance is bliss, but it's not a good place to be.
right. Karen, thank you so much. This is really valuable, and everybody who was here, thanks for bringing your time and attention. Karen, would it be okay? I imagine what happens sometimes is people come up with questions after the fact. If they email them to me, can I forward them on to you? And
Absolutely.
I think would be great. We got a couple questions, and I'll just ask them to you, and then we can post it in our group so that everybody has access to those answers. That'd be okay.
Absolutely.
Awesome. And yeah, so everybody, any questions, let me know. I'll send you the slides that Karen shared with us today. And if you didn't get the handout, I'll include that in an email so you can make notes. And what do we do instead of a round of applause? I guess you like go like this or something. Isn't that the modern thing? Woo, way to go, Karen.
Thank you, Karen.
That's a lot.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being here. I look forward to hopefully talking with some of you again in the future. And we've been focusing on executive comp, key employee comp here. But it's a challenge at every level. So that, if you've got struggles, I can imagine most of you have struggles if you're looking for hourly workers. It's a tough time right now. Constantly working with clients on that. So even if it's just a reality check, hey, is it just us? Because sometimes within an organization, you think, hey, no matter how many articles you're reading about what's going on out there, and $15 an hour quickly turned to 17 to 22 to 24 to 30 to all kinds of crazy numbers. So you got context, you want to run something by somebody, I'm here.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
All right. Oops. And we went a minute over. I'm sorry.
Yeah, pretty close. Hey, see you all around. Thanks a bunch. Go get them, gang.
All right,
Bye.
hey guys.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
See you guys.